Chris, welcome.
Joe, good to be with you.
Christopher or Chris?
You know what? Let's go with Chris.
Okay. We spoke before in London 2012, and you were very busy, and I nagged you to do a radio interview for 10 minutes, and it saved my bacon. So belated thanks for that.
I think we talked a few times, but that was back in those early 2000s period. Yeah, right.
Yeah, London 2012. Yeah, a few times since, but in person 2012. So congrats on the book. A labour of love for sure. I have to say, I didn't really realise your dulcet American tones had fooled me all these years. Long story short, you fell in love with a French girl and you're kind of honorary European and you've spent a lot of time in this part of the world.
Yeah, it definitely changed my life. It was not something that was, I think, probably part of the plan. She walked into my life in San Diego where I was working in my early years in journalism, and it changed my whole career path, honestly, and all my interests in life and everything. So, yeah, I'm very thankful for that.
Yes, and so therefore Roland Garros has played a big part in your world. It's a centre point, obviously, of Nadal's career. Hence, you've kind of the framework of the book, I suppose, in many ways, is through the prism of Nadal and French Open, for obvious reasons, of course.
Yeah, I think it was the idea was I didn't want to reduce Nadal to clay. I don't think that's fair to him by any means. He won 8 majors outside of clay, and he was number one and did many, many things outside of that surface. But it is the surface that's going to define him in our memories, I think. 14 number of French Opens that he won is an absolutely crazy number, one of the craziest numbers in sports. And it was sort of for me, felt like it was sort of destined to be in terms of literary product because I knew the place so well by the time he arrived. I had been there already covering it for over a decade. It's the tournament that I've lived closest to, a major sporting event that I lived closest to, that I felt the most connection to, I would say, because of being married to my wife and learning the culture and the language as I covered Roland Garros over the years. And was very drawn to clay court tennis as well, Joe, because I hadn't played much of that as a kid growing up in California and Hawaii. It was all hard courts for us. So it was an exotic thing. So I think it all kind of came together. And as I saw Rafa gradually just become part of the scenery, if you will, and just take command of the place, it just started to seem like a good idea to try to bring the two threads together. And the challenge, of course, is to try to do that in a structure and a narrative in a book where you don't want it to be about you. It's a book about Nadal. But I thought it was helpful for me to bring it all together, to once in a while interject myself, and also to just really, really drill down into this place, this surface, this tournament that Nadal transformed, honestly. And I don't think we'll ever see anything quite like it.
Yes, and we should get on to the brilliance and just how he managed to do it. But if we could, what I thoroughly enjoyed amongst other aspects of the book was learning about his personality, because, well, I guess like a lot of people, I was a Federer guy, and then along he comes with his sleeveless shirt and those stupid clam digger shorts, and I just didn't like him. I just did not like him. And you make the observation as well that in Spanish, he was a far more, for obvious reasons, better able to express himself and communicate. He was a far more compelling speaker in Spanish than he was in English, especially in the early years. So even that aspect, I couldn't quite connect with him. But having read this book, he seems like a very strikingly and genuinely good person. And there's a great quote from a French Open administrator later on in the book, Gilles Jourdain. And this is not to pitch Nadal and Federer against each other, of course, but it's instructive nonetheless into Nadal. And so Gilles Jourdain observed of their time at Roland Garros over the years. Nadal was much more sympathetic than Federer. Our impression here was that Federer does not give his time. He's polite, but nothing more. There's no interaction. He's not mean or rude, but as we used to say, he was the false son-in-law. Nadal was the real deal. And this is a common thread throughout your book. Nadal, the person, is the real deal, is very much what your book suggests.
Yeah, I should emphasize it. I wrote a book, Joe, about Federer called The Master before this. My interactions with Roger have always been very rich, and I've seen a great deal of empathy in him and many great qualities. And so I don't want to make this into a let's put Roger down, but I thought it was very interesting, and I did include it because I felt like this was Gilles Jourdain, who's somebody who had no agenda. He was behind the scenes working at the French Open for many, many years. He saw the whole arc of their careers. He probably doesn't know Roger or Rafa away from that environment, but he did have a good look at them and all the employees there about how they interacted. And so I thought it was worth including just to give people a sense of how Rafa was processed, if you will, and understood, and how Roger was processed and understood it in Paris here. And definitely it made me think a lot. But I think Rafa's background, much less cosmopolitan than Roger's. Roger has a South African mother by birth and a Swiss father, was very intercontinental, international in his approach growing up, had to change environments a few times. Rafa did not. Rafa stayed very anchored in his island home of Mallorca, and he's not in Palma, which is the more busy, bustling city of Mallorca. He's from Manacor, which is, I think, certainly more insular, less touristy, very much multi-generational, more traditional place. And certainly that shaped him. And yet he also, I'd say, came from a family that understood what stardom was. Miguel Angel Nadal, his uncle, one of his uncles was a superstar soccer player in Spain, national team player, rugged central defender at Barca and Mallorca, and definitely a star in Spain and a little bit beyond when Rafa was a very young boy. So he grew up in that environment. So that wasn't unfamiliar to him, but his anchor was always Mallorca. That's a place where you don't want to seem bigger than your britches. It's a place where you want to be very in touch with all the people in your village and connect. And I think his family and his uncle Tony Nadal, who was his tennis coach from the age of 4 and the second biggest influence on him after his parents, definitely emphasized being correct, putting on a good face and showing people who cross your path, whomever they might be, a lot of respect. And I think that really came through as I reported the book. And I was definitely not averse to finding negative things about Rafa, and there are a few, but considering how long a run he had, Joe, and how much interaction and pressure he had to deal with, pretty clean sheet. And I think that's one thing that stands out is he's just really treats the big people and the, if you will, little people pretty much the same.
Yeah. You say at one point he passes the taxi driver test.
He does, yeah. And too many fail that, unfortunately.
Seems to have remained grounded. Mallorca has remained home. He married a local. He stays a local. It's not to suggest either he's bereft of ego or some kind of simpleton who doesn't understand his position in the game and in the world, but he hasn't moved to a penthouse in Monaco either.
No, Rafa lives very well. Let's not let me underestimate that. The boat is big. The clifftop mansion that he's just built is not one that you or I are going to be buying anytime soon. So it's definitely let's not diminish the lifestyle. And he has other places besides where he lives in Mallorca, but there is that anchor, and I think that's kept him grounded, literally grounded, and that he would want to keep that format for his life is, I think, quite instructive, quite telling.
Yeah.
I don't think it's feigned. And I think ultimately you reach a certain level of celebrity like these guys have. He's probably one of the 15 or 20 most famous sportsmen in the world, if not at times in the top 10. I think a place like Mallorca where people are not going to kowtow to you and not going to treat you like you're anything super special. I'm sure he's treated as if he's special, but kind of keep it real. I think that's really good, and I think those guys after a certain time they seek that. They get plenty of of sycophantry out in the circuit and everything else. I think Rafa liked the fact that Mallorca kept him real, and his wife is understated as well on that. And I think it's a good lesson probably in that if you stray too far from your roots, sometimes it's harder to keep a good understanding of yourself.
Yeah. We can all be guilty of the halo effect and assuming because he's very good at tennis, he's very good at lots of things. He does seem, though, to have a decent brain in there and a wisdom. For instance, there's the quote he gave you at one stage late on in his career when, he's been asked about hitting certain landmarks in the sport and the race with Djokovic is on, etc. He says, clearly there's always someone with more money, a bigger boat, a more beautiful wife. I can't always be looking outside because it's a recipe for constant unhappiness. It has to come from the inside. So, that suggests a thoughtfulness. If you were to be critical, you could say, well, it's also just fridge magnet wisdom. Does he strike you as a happy person, content with his lot, in a good place?
He's had some tough times, Joe, and I go into that in the book. 2015, 2016 in particular, that period there, which kind of gets lost in in the midst of 14 French Opens and all the dominance. He was in a bad place, very anxious, had stage fright on the court, really couldn't perform. I think he had a lot of anxiety off the court as well. I mean, Rafa's rituals and obsessions, if you will, I'm sure there's been some sort of carryover. He insists that his room is a mess and, he doesn't have to be all in order off the court, and it helps him compete. And I believe him, but I think there is an edgy, nervous, anxious streak in Rafa. If you know him, he's got a super hyperactive type of personality. He's always doing something. He just revs at a higher energy. But he's had some crisis points along the way for sure. And I think some of those things that sound like fridge wisdom maybe are hard earned. I don't think Rafa's an intellectual by any means, but he's somebody who has a good worldview. And I think it's been important for him to really understand himself and be true to himself. And he talks a lot about happiness, which is interesting. I don't know so many great athletes that I've interviewed who focus so hard on that aspect of it, or for that matter, really want to have a deep connection to the people behind the scenes, as he clearly does at these tournaments he goes to. Those are important to him on a different level. But he talks a lot about happiness in our interviews and about, creating these sort of structures for looking at his career and how he achieves things, chasing Federer at number one for a while, or trying to reach the number of Grand Slams that another player has, or winning a 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th French Open. He always resisted that. And I don't think it was just because he was blowing smoke at us. I think it's because he sensed if he got caught up in that with his personality type, Joe, that he would really, it would make him miserable. And he wouldn't be able to live the kind of life free in his head that he wanted to.
Yeah. Your sense is he kept the focus narrow on next point, next match.
I think very intentionally, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I think he got to 14, really, maybe we'll talk about this later, but that's one of the reasons we got to 14.
Yeah. There's a point in the book where Jim Courier gets almost misty-eyed, genuinely.
Oh, no, he does get misty-eyed.
Tearful when talking about how blown away he is by the extent to which Nadal can always just focus on the next point. He said, of all the players, and I would have thought it might have been a Djokovic perhaps, but he said of all the players he's come across, played against, watched, Nadal was the most ferocious when it came to concentration on the next point. There was no ebb and flow.
Yeah, that's why I called it the warrior, honestly. I resist sort of these bellicose imagery in sport. I thought long and hard about it, but there is that element of like, gentleman farmer laying down his hoe and going off to do battle when Rafa does his things on the court. He definitely, puts on the bandana and goes into a faraway place where he is going to do some form of battle. And war imagery in sports is often overused, and I apologize if people feel it is in this case, but I just thought it was the right image. And I think what Jim's got misty-eyed about, and he was really very overcome, and it came out of the blue. I think it really surprised me when I was talking to him, was two things. What you mentioned, just the competitive nature of Rafa, the way he's able to go micro and get the best out of himself again and again and again in a very repetitive, grinding sport. And the self-mastery. In terms of tennis will drive you crazy. I don't know if you play. I know I play. It drives me crazy. I don't think I'm always the same person on the court as I am off. I have a hard time keeping it all in check. But he was really blown away, as many people were, by Rafa's ability not to throw a racket. And he had a couple altercations with umpires over the years, hardly any. He really kept it together on a really, really elite level. And I think the guys who play the game at that level and know the pressures were really, really impressed by that aspect of it. And they should be.
Yeah.
So and the other thing I'd say, Joe, is that, Djokovic, I think you're right. Djokovic did achieve that state many times in his career. But Rafa kind of arrived on the circuit fully formed as a mental giant, I would say. That's the thing that's surprising.
Right.
A lot of guys, and Djokovic became one. Federer, I'm not sure ever quite became a giant mentally, but he certainly got very, very good. But Rafa, from a very early age, through that discipline and probably the education that Tony provided and his own character, he arrived in terms of mental strength, already at the top of the chain at 17, 18. And that sets him apart.
Yeah. You cited Murray in a retirement video for Nadal saying, you're the only one of us that's never thrown a racket in anger. It's kind of a freakish thing. We'll get to Tony just to round off.
He did say, Joe, real quickly to interrupt you, but to Andy with his humor, did point out that PlayStation was a different matter.
Yes.
And that Rafa was hurling the console across the room. So maybe it's just a tennis thing. But anyway.
Which makes it even more impressive, perhaps,
Yeah,
that fire is there, and yet somehow in his professional world, it's kept at bay. Just to round off this kind of area on his personality, and we'll get into some other stuff. People's ears will have interest will have been piqued by your point about the stage fright or the anxiety around 15, 16. I didn't know that was happening at the time, I have to say. So, do we know what prompted it, and then how did he get on top of it?
Well, I don't know exactly what prompted it. I mean, there's probably more to come on this. I know there's a documentary coming out on Nadal next year, early or late this year with Netflix that he's been a big part of, and I'm sure they're going to explore this aspect because it's quite interesting. What I do know is that Rafa, if you watch him when he's young, when he's playing, he's revving at a very high motor engine speed. He's very, very quick actually between points. He's very keyed up, and then the rituals were actually suggested to him as a way to sort of slow things down, looking through the balls, adding a little bit more time with the towel, kind of slowing yourself down because he was playing at a pace where he could have burned himself out and kind of run out of energy in matches when he was 12, 13, 14. So that was an intentional thing from Tony, his coach, and others to sort of help him get through that. It kind of became a monster, but you can see that Rafa's rituals and that sort of need to keep things in control to that degree. I mean, it's not unlike an American baseball pitcher or a golfer or something like that, but definitely in tennis, it's a ritualistic sport, but he goes pretty much to the max with it. And that reflects an underlying current of anxiety and concern, I think, when he competes. So maybe not surprising that at some point or another, it sort of peaked and hit an unhealthy level. And I think it did at that point. I'm sure he sought some psychiatric help there to try to get through it. He also made some changes. He brought in Carlos Moya into his coaching team for 2017, which was sort of the year when he was able to break out of that and become the player he could be again. And also he got a lot of strength and renewal out of the Olympics in Rio in 2016. He'd had injuries that year in 16. He had to pull out of the French Open after 2 rounds with a wrist problem. Really was having a tough year, and he went to Rio and played doubles with Mark Lopez, his good buddy. He ended up winning the gold medal. He also played well in the singles, but I think he really took a lot of heart and strength from kind of reconnecting with the Spanish team and his peers and kind of tapping into a team ethic there. But I don't know all the details, but I know that he hit pretty low. And I think also, Rafa's intensity and competition, he's got a great code, but also let's face it. I mean, Djokovic got inside his head, I'm sure at times, because of his brilliance and his own ability to negate some of Rafa's strengths. And there were periods in the career where only time I ever saw Rafa play hundreds of matches live, and only times I ever saw him sort of beaten ahead of time were a very few Djokovic matches. So that's part of it too. Maybe trying to deal with that aspect of it and try to solve that riddle, which he was having trouble solving.
So to Roland Garros, which is the centre point of his career, I suppose, and kind of anchors the book. And you said a few moments ago that you didn't want to reduce Rafa Nadal to just French Open maestro or present him as a one-dimensional player. I mean, I kind of had a deeper appreciation for the 14 French Open titles reading the book, I have to say. Like you quoted Ilie Nastase in the early 90s when he was reflecting on Bjorg having won 6, and he said, but nobody's going to win 6 again like Bjorg. That was a different time. And then along comes this freak of nature. As you say, 2 Wimbledons, 2 Australians, 4 US Opens, 8 majors outside of the French puts him in very good company with the all-time greats. But to win 14 French Opens, I guess it was easy just to assume it was too easy for him, but the audacity of it really comes across. The way so many protagonists in the book, I'll read some of the quotes in a few moments, but the way so many of them talk about him on clay in like hushed tones, it has elevated my opinion of the 14 French Opens.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because I think for me, going back and trying to do it after the fact, systematically, elevated my appreciation. I was in it, and honestly, we, like everybody, we crave a bit of novelty, don't we? As journalists, the story is not Rafa winning number 11, number 12. The story is Rafa not winning number 11, number 12. But I think as time went on, you began to realize when you were covering it, year to year, how extraordinary this was. But I don't think I could fully grasp how it happened, to be honest with you. So one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, I wanted to go back and really try to force myself to look at each one separately. And ultimately, I think that's what I learned was that Rafa did the same. Rafa did not look at it as, okay, I won 5, I'm going to win 6. It was never like that for him. And it sounds easy to say that, but it really is very, very hard to train your mind to not think in those terms because it's something you've already done. I really feel like most of the time when he came back to Roland Garros, he saw it as a set piece. It was that year, that challenge, and whatever shape he was in, that was what he was facing. And he was able to really narrow in and play that tournament as a separate entity. And I think that's how he was able to pull it off. There really aren't many other examples in individual sport, Joe. You can look at stuff like Michael Phelps with the 28 medals, the Olympics, and all the golds. A lot of relays in there. You can look at stuff like Bolt or Tiger at times on his runs. But to come back to the same place again and again like this in a major sporting event and be able to win it most of the time and get to 14 is just a sign of, I think, above all, extraordinary method and will. Obviously, he has huge talent. That's clear. But there were so few slip-ups. I mean, he played only in the almost 20 years he played the French Open. He only had 3 5-set matches. The first 4 that he won, Joe, he didn't play a single 5-setter. And he was young then, and he should have had a learning curve to follow. So it shows you there was a big delta with the rest of the opposition, and he's playing against all-time great players here with Federer at close to his peak in those early years and Djokovic emerging and some very good clay court players around, people like David Ferrer and Ferrero. So something exceptional was happening here. But I think Emilio Sanchez Vicario called it the perfect storm. Emilio was a great Spanish player, top 10, long before Rafa, and he's a good student of the game. And I think it was the perfect storm. It was amazing athlete who would have been, I think, a great soccer player if he hadn't been a great tennis player. Mm. Perfect sort of discipline in his upbringing with Tony and the way that he is able to be consistent with him and create this code. Rafa's character to be able to handle it all. And then this early connection to the surface from an early age. The first court that he played on was clay. It was across the street from his family's apartment. And he just knew how to move on it. He understood it. It was a natural element. I call it in the book, like water was for Phelps or midair was for Simone Biles. And I think it's true. I'm not sure he always loved that he was so great on clay. Sometimes I think he wouldn't have minded not having that burden to bear, but he undoubtedly was. And honestly, how often can we say, Joe, that an athlete has this great opportunity and maximizes it? He came about as close as you can to saying that.
Yes. Didn't get sick of it, kept doing it. The discipline is ferocious, Look at
Bjork. And by the end, the amazing thing too was that we all wanted novelty. We all wanted somebody else to kind of upset this narrative we were getting tired of. But by the end, there was this sort of form of just admiration and sort of the French say émerveillement. You sort of marveling at this mental giant who's able to pull this off again and again and still have the desire and the ability in his late 30s to do it.
Yeah, we must talk about his relationship with the crowd. So his first in 05 at 19 and then his last in 22 at 36. And you mentioned it. Like he was favoured for 05 as a 19-year-old in his first French Open and delivered. The only comparison I could think of that was Tiger Woods at the Masters, so well signposted in advance and delivered at a major. It's kind of one of the few.
You think Tiger was the favorite in that first one? I know he did well as an amateur, right? So
yeah. Well, just so hotly anticipated. This guy's going to be the greatest, they're saying, and then won out the gate. So I guess Nadal had that in common with them. If you don't mind, a few quotes from some people, and I should emphasize the book is full of these rich observations from so many different people in the game. So Federer, we're talking Federer here, Rafa's movement on clay, it's just better than the rest because he has an open stance on both sides. It's like he's playing 2 forehands from the baseline. I can't do that. So I lose a meter or 2 here and there. So he's got this huge advantage in that aspect. I don't know how he grew up doing that, but it's very difficult. Gilles Simon, you know what's coming, but it doesn't help. Feliciano Lopez, to play Rafa on clay is the worst experience a player can have. First of all, 99.9% you're going to lose. But second of all, you feel so vulnerable. You can lose 6-1, 6-1, but you didn't do anything wrong. And then there was a really a kind of a passing of the torch almost. On the eve of his win in 05 as a 19-year-old, he has a hit out with Mats Wilander, who was the last first-time winner at a Grand Slam back in 82. And he'd been watching Nadal like everyone, but playing with him, he seemed to have this moment of, oh my God, this is way more sophisticated and complicated than I had realised. There's more height on every ball coming at me. There's more spin. Talked about how it's just this relentless pain of having to hit these backhands to him, like too high. And he says it's like climbing a ladder again and again and again and again. And so the book is littered with these greats in the game going, you think you understand how good this guy is. You've no idea till you're out there with him.
That's it. I think that's what we needed to do in this book, was to try to give people a sense of how those who really understood the elements of the game, how they felt when they confronted him. And Mats obviously never played him in a match. Mats is a different generation.
Yeah.
But, Mats won 3 French Opens, was a wonderful clay court player in his era. So I thought it was very telling just to hear what he had to say about the experience of hitting with Rafa. And Rafa's a pretty intense practice player, always has been, one of his hallmarks. So you get a pretty real sense of the ball from doing that. And Mats just said, it's just a new paradigm. And I think it helps you understand, how the heck he 6'1", 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", 6'3", 6 love. These guys are great players he's playing. Maybe not great, but really, really good. And he's able just to consistently dominate. And that's because what he's providing them, yes, they can handle it for a little while, but they can't handle it for very long. And I just think having to repeatedly go high and hit out of your comfort zone and know that if you leave a ball short against Rafa on clay, he's going to destroy you with that forehand and just give you an angle you can't deal with. And if you happen to lunge and reach that, the next ball will be even more powerful into another part of the court. So it's just relentless. There's also a great quote in there from a player who's, kind of a minor player in tennis history, but Kevin Kim. He talks about it's like staring into the Sahara and seeing dune after dune, in the distance kind of thing, which I love that. And I think, as I'm a college level player, I understand what it's like to hit a ball, but I'm not anywhere near a pro. And so to hear these pros to sort of give you this sense of resignation, but also marveling at the technique and what's creating this, I thought was the best way to go about it.
Yeah, it's great. It's very impactful, and it's great to get even a technical understanding of what's going on. And you write with both the technical and the romance of the slide in clay. You talk about how on clay, and it was a great way of putting it. You see, you slide in anticipation of changing direction. So you're timing your contact with the ball at the very end of your skid, so you can move back in the opposite way. You get it too early, too late, it's a disaster. But right. Nadal, again, because you think of him as muscles and grit and brute force, but there's a balletic aspect to that.
Yeah, a lot of people think about when you watch clay court tennis, if you don't play, and I played all my life and haven't played much clay court tennis, they think you're sliding through the shot, but you're not. You're sliding to the shot. And if you're sliding through the shot, you're in trouble because the shot's gone, you're still sliding, and you are losing a second or a half second, which you cannot afford to lose as you finish your slide and then change direction. So that's the art. And as Roger Federer once told me, we're talking about this, Roger was a great clay court player. I mean, if Rafa hadn't emerged from Mallorca, his life would have been very different on clay. He would have won many French Opens, I'm sure. But he said basically, the key in sliding is also when you don't slide. People come out there, they think they're going to be clay courters, they slide on everything. You don't do that. And Rafa doesn't slide on everything either. So it's knowing when and how and not thinking about it. Obviously, it has to be anchored in you because you don't have time to think about how you're going to slide. But the Spaniards call it patinar, Joe, which is to skate when you slide on the clay. And I think that's a good one. It's a foreign, hostile element to many, but for those who are at ease on it, it's a place where they're just at home.
Wow.
And Rafa was
amazing. You can't describe it better than that. You mentioned the crowd and Rafa. So I thought, I've heard a couple of other interviews you've done, and everybody's very taken with the backlash chapter, and it is really interesting. So 2 aspects to his relationship with the crowd. We'll come to the doping in a moment, but just first of all, his dominance, and you chart that. So great excitement that the prodigy arrives in 2005, of course, and there's novelty. By the time it gets to his defeat to Soderling in 2009, as early as 2009, they're kind of against him. Tony Nadal, we'll come to Tony in due course, the uncle coach. There's only one category of fans worse than the French, he said on Spanish radio, you're right, and it's the Parisians. The Parisian crowd is stupid. So give chart for us, and the doping thing will come to in a second, but just the French crowd and their relationship with superstar, boredom, and then you can chart where somewhere it reached like a kind of warm appreciation of a legend towards the end.
It wasn't even just boredom, Joe. It was, I'd say, resentment in a way.
Ah, okay.
You're taking away our toy here. You're taking away the joy of our toy. We want to have it be something suspenseful, and also French crowds. It's changing, but over a long time, it's been very men's tennis focused there. It's not a balanced thing. It hasn't been traditionally. Women's tennis has gotten I think short shrift often in the French Open universe. So it's really the men's tournament is a big thing, more than maybe other places. Too big a thing. But he definitely, there was serious Rafa fatigue, and don't forget that in 2008. In the final, he absolutely destroyed Federer. It was a final that they were in the middle of their rivalry, really getting great, and there was huge anticipation for that final in Paris. Roger seemed to be in great shape, and Rafa just cranked it up and played one of his greatest matches and gave him no room and destroyed him and looked barely, out of respect, hardly celebrated when he won.
And sorry to interrupt, the Wimbledon crowd just months later gets served up the greatest match potentially of all time. Yeah. Okay. So they're shortchanged.
Part of the reason Rafa won that match was because of what happened in Paris. But you're right. The French crowd is not getting these classics at all. They're getting these, routes. And so that was the stage. Rafa comes back in 2009. And I was at that match, or at least the second half of it, because I didn't think it would be a match at all. And I had to run to my seat after I saw what was happening. But it was very anti-Rafa. It was not just pro Soderling, and that hurt him. It really hurt him. It didn't really fit with his code. He never, unlike Tony, he never ripped the French crowd about it or ripped the French, but it had to hurt. And it was funny when he talked about this the other day at his ceremony, and he talked about just the connection to Paris. He said, in the last 10 to 15 years, I have felt a really strong connection. So he didn't pick that number out of nowhere. If you do the math, 2025 minus 15 is 2010. So clearly, he was separating that from what happened before. But it was tough to. He's a young guy then. He's not an older guy at all, not a veteran. He's still in his early 20s, and it had to hurt. And I think the crowd, we can talk about why beyond just the Rafa fatigue, but I think also they'd seen a lot of Spaniards win at Roland Garros over the years too. Bruguera won a couple of times, Moya won, Costa, Ferrero, a lot of finalists were Spanish. And it was kind of a repetitive baseline-driven game. I think Rafa is very fun to watch, but he also is a baseliner at heart. So I think there's also a fatigue with a certain style of play, and that Federer, with his all-court game and incredibly aesthetic style of tennis, really appealed to the French like it appeals to everybody. And he was the underdog. They wanted to see him do well. So Rafa, they just had their fill.
Yeah. And when did you detect a warming up?
Well, I mean, the warming up, I think, after that 15-16 period, I would say we talked about, when they saw how low he got, and he got destroyed by Djokovic in the quarterfinals in straight sets in 2015. That was Rafa's, in real Rafa, not counting the Zverev match at the very end. That was his, really only lopsided loss at Roland Garros. But he just looked, like a defeated guy, and he was in a slump, but he was still like on the edge of the top 10, but he was no longer a big factor. So I think when you see a great champion brought pretty low, and then they come back and they show their love for your tournament, and then you needed that arc. I think if he'd stayed on the top all the way, it might have been a bit different, but I think that having that happen and see him vulnerable humanized him, and then he was able to come back and reel off another 4 in a row there. And I think that really was a time when they kind of consolidated around, wow, this is special.
Okay.
It is special. But there was also the element you mentioned before.
Yeah. So, well, give us that then. There's a standoffishness, and you detail it very well in the book. I suppose he is, assuming he's clean, and there's no indication he's not. He is a victim, therefore, you can use that word, of the era in which he arrived. I mean, there's a certain dude winning a lot of yellow jerseys down the road, and they've been fairly burned by that.
Yeah, I mean, he comes into an environment, not just in France, but really in France, particularly where there's enormous and very understandable skepticism about great sporting achievement, in that sense that if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. We're coming out of Marion Jones, and athletics is a big thing in France at this point still. And coming out of not just Lance Armstrong, but a whole series of doping scandals in cycling. Tour de France is a major cultural and sporting event in France. Other sports affected as well. Just widespread concerns about it all. And let's not forget, I mean, when Rafa won his first French Open in 2005, amazing achievement, as you mentioned, to be going to play his first and being pretty much the favorite and managing to pull it off. But the guy he beat was Mariano Puerta, who was banned for 8 years, later reduced, but for doping after that final. And there have been some other players, Argentines, who tested positive, who were clay court players as well. People like Coria and Chela, who were, these were not hardcore drugs they were busted for, but they did have doping violations. So there was this undercurrent within tennis already. And then there was the Operation Puerto, which was the investigation in Spain. There were some unnamed sources or unbylined stories linking Rafa to that early on. All the officials involved denied that his name was involved. There was never any proof, but then there was never full disclosure either. The blood bags that they were part of that investigation were eventually destroyed, I believe, and never released in terms of results. But again, Rafa was in this climate. There's no evidence that he cheated. I have no knowledge of anybody ever talking to me on or off the record about a positive test of any sort. So you have to, and I do believe the system as it's evolved is better than it used to be. And some people also in the book I talked to, which was rare to get them on the record, doping officials said that he was targeted early. They knew these results were exceptional when he was playing the satellites and the challengers, and they gave him the full force of what they had, all the blood, all the urine testing. They didn't find anything.
Yeah.
So, here we are. But the climate of that, plus some of the things that were happening with the French press and Yannick Noah, who's a revered figure in France and a former French Open champion, Frenchman, came out with an article in Le Monde where he talked about the Spanish and their magic potion. He didn't mention Nadal in the story, but he did mention tennis and other sports, how the Spanish are suddenly winning everything. It's a magic potion. And then there's satirical programs showing him with syringes and King Kong on top of buildings. So all this stuff's building up. I don't want to, obviously the book is the book, so I don't want to narrate it to you, but
yeah, no, it's
just the whole issue was all part of Rafa's journey.
Yeah.
And not just in Paris, but really especially there because it was there that he was so extraordinarily dominant and sort of beggared belief, if you will, by what he was able to achieve. So
yeah.
And not Rafa and his team knew that was an issue, and they were very sensitive to it and did their best to try to not completely just run away and hide from it. They tried to address it. And there's some interviews, especially with L'Equipe, the French sports daily, where Rafa really goes deep on how it felt to be in the midst of this sort of current of suspicion and explains his methods. And so it's a big topic.
Yeah, it is. And it was great that you dealt with it.
I think you had to, Joe. You can't write a journalistic book about him and not deal with it.
No. Well, listen, some might. 08 in Beijing, that Olympics, they obviously, because tennis at that time, testing was average. But Beijing Olympics, they would have kept tests for 8 years. 20 athletes subsequently stripped of medals in those games. His tests were fine. Again, though, if you're being cynical, if you get caught with an in-competition test, frankly, you failed an intelligence test, really. Operation Puerto, I remember that being such a big thing. This is Dr. Fuentes, and like it was very much like cycling initially, but then it was football teams, dominant at the time to Spanish football, massively under the microscope, and then tennis players, and of course Spain tennis player. It only points to one person at the time, and then when Spanish courts made the decision on privacy laws to destroy the blood bags, Nadal himself called it a mistake. Andy Murray, memorably at the time, that was 2013, tweeted it was the biggest cover-up in sports. He was livid as a fellow tennis player. Nadal, and you chart it in the book, like a few missteps, I think you would say, in his public utterances. Like he called the WADA whereabouts testing intolerable harassment. Subsequently supported it, but at the time he said, I have to tell them where I am all the time, and wasn't happy about that. He publicly supported Alberto Contador, 3-time Tour de France winner, who claimed, his result was a consequence of tainted meat. You said in the book his team were against Nadal making these public comments, and he subsequently wrote back in them, but they weren't great. And I'd forgotten, it was big at the time, I'd forgotten those kind of spitting image, French equivalent portrayals of him you know, the puppet of Nadal with a big syringe, or he was peeing into his Land Rover instead of putting fuel into it, and the Land Rover speeds off. And you mentioned the King Kong one. And then the French former Minister for Health, Youth and Sport in the French government. You might tell people about this. This was even interesting. In 2016, she was on French television around the time Maria Sharapova was done for meldonium. And out of nowhere on TV, she talks about a period where Nadal was injured, and she said, we know that the injury to Nadal, which lasted 7 months, is certainly due to a positive test. When you see a tennis player out of action for a long time, it's usually because they've tested positive. He took her to court. That went big.
Yeah, and that was the one time when Rafa decided to go legal. I think just after all that had happened, he'd sort of let it kind of roll off and talked about it, but not done anything legal about it. So he did take Bachelot to court over that one. She was not the acting sports minister at the time, but he felt as a former sports minister, she was a credible person. And for her to make that statement, put things on a different level. And he won that case by, I think, proving there was no evidence of a positive test. But it was also, a victim of the system as well. Whatever happened or didn't happen that we can or cannot prove, there's no doubt that the system, by not announcing a player's sanction until they had gone through the whole process of adjudicating it, and there being no understanding or awareness of it. This has obviously become an issue again recently with Sinner and Swiatek in tennis. But at the time, there was a standard practice where they would not announce after the first adverse finding, and they would go through the whole process and only announce at the end. So that created this gray area where a player's not playing. Why are they not playing? And that's what Bachelot was referring to. But, as the court case proved, I don't think she had any evidence that Rafa had any kind of a positive test. And it was just making that assumption. So he ultimately knew he had to do it, and it had his fill, and he took her to court. And he said if anybody else made those kind of allegations, he would take them to court as well after that. And it definitely has calmed down, maybe in part because of that. Yeah. But, it's the era we live in. And
it's a tough thing.
Unfortunately, we shouldn't feel guilty about having suspicions, because unfortunately the world of sport has created this environment.
I was just going to say, it's precisely the point, Jed. It's a really difficult climate where the burden of proof is on the athlete. And how does the athlete prove it? And that we're left in this limbo.
I mean, he has called for, he wanted to publish all his results in more detail. He wanted to kind of go above and beyond the system. I guess he could have done it on his own. I don't know why he didn't do that, but he also called for the blood bags and the Puerto operation to be released and all. So, Rafa has said the right things. But what you referred to before, our connection got a little bit unstable there. I didn't hear all of what you said, but I heard you talking about the fact that he was complaining about the whereabouts system and people showing up at his house at 6 a.m. and even his mother couldn't come at that time of day, kind of thing. I think he made some mistakes there. That only fed a little bit of suspicion, because he was complaining about a system that was put in place because there was a big problem and it needed to be addressed. And in very extreme ways, unfortunately, but sport and sports federations brought this upon themselves, in my view. And so Rafa should have clued into that more quickly than he did.
Let's just finish on Uncle Tony. We haven't scratched the surface of this book, but I'm sure people have got a great taste for it. So Uncle Tony is just how I knew him all these years as well. I guess the most famous Uncle Tony in the world. He starts throwing tennis balls to a 3-4-year-old Rafa. And we have a prodigy at our hands. That's what's so thrilling and exciting. Nature versus nurture. There was certainly some nature there. And you quote as well Alberto Tous, who was from Mallorca and played on the ATP Tour, and he came back, and Tony sort of said, "Come here, watch this kid hit." And Tous kind of says that he's a wall, like this 3-4-year-old. The ball just keeps coming back. And like, what a thrilling kind of image that is.
In like 90 seconds, he just didn't miss.
Yeah. So
90 seconds doesn't sound that long, but if you watch a tennis match, watch a point, they don't last 90 seconds, and he's just hitting the ball back every time. Yeah.
Tous' sense of Tony is Tony did very good work. He was very good in the beginning, very good at discipline, very good at education, all those things. But he says the technical part, someone like Carlos Moya had a big effect. People say Tony is the best coach in the world. I mean, that's going too far. There are a lot of people who know a lot more about tennis. So that was his sense of the job that Uncle Tony has done all these years.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things about the research on the book as well that was interesting to see. I always had that sense, but I hadn't really explored it journalistically. And there's no doubt that it took more of a village to make Rafa who he was than I would have suspected, or that I would have known fully. And that there were people who were advisors at key times, just that he went to Albert Tus and showed him Rafa's game at that very early age. So there's sort of this lovely feeling of Tony's a very strong personality. He's got a totally distinctive kind of gravelly tenor voice. You ever hear him speak, you never forget it. And they all can imitate him, which is fun. But there's this sense of like, Tony's been bringing these people to them for years already. Like, this guy's going to be great. And they're like, yeah, that's great, Tony. Yeah, he's pretty good. And then this time he goes, my nephew, you got to see him. He's going to be great. And they're like, you know what? He is going to be great. Huh. So it was kind of like the man who had all the energy and desire and passion for it and had developed great expertise. Let's not minimize it. I think was able to finally hit the jackpot with, of all people, his nephew, the one he, with the dinner table growing up around. It's crazy coincidence. But Tony had that lovely ability, I think, despite having a healthy ego, to seek advice and counsel and help when he thought it was necessary. And I know from talking to coaches that frequented them a lot in the early years, he was like a sponge. Give me all the information. Tell me what I need to know. And that's also to his credit and part of the reason why it worked. But no, I mean, Tony was not a technician, but he did, have the perspective and generosity of spirit to hire Francis Roig, a tour level player who was coaching Feliciano Lopez as sort of his assistant coach. And he was there for almost all of Rafa's majors, if not all of them. And Francis was a great technician.
Yeah.
Footwork, the technique, the small adjustments, the swing doctor, if you will, compared to golf. So those people were in Rafa's orbit, and Tony was the coordinator and the motivator in chief. And I think, honestly, I don't use the word lightly. I think he was a genius in terms of the way he handled the mental side with Rafa.
Yeah.
And was able to transmit that stuff. But the overall arc of the game was a much more of a village approach.
Yeah. You said Tony would create obstacles and use worn down balls in training so that Rafa could learn to adapt, all these kind of things. And Alberto Tus gives you a great, unbelievable story when you stop and think about it. When, Rafa has won 4 or 5 French Opens at this stage and they're playing golf together. And he says, Rafa, let's go get some lunch. And Rafa's like, oh, no, I can't. Tony's waiting. I've 1 hour. I'm going to have to get some pizza on the run. And if I don't arrive on time, he's going to kill me. And Tus, makes this strangling motion saying, geez. So, It doesn't seem like for a long time, if at all, Rafa ever fully kind of grew out of the disciplinarian that was Tony at times.
Yeah, I think that's part of the family element. I think if Tony had been outside the family and coach mentor, I don't see that dynamic being the same or lasting as long as it did. And I think Tony had a great gift for maybe younger players. I don't know if his gift extends to the same degree to a pro, fully adult, independent player. I'm sure he's very good, but I think he's special with the youngsters, with his clarity of purpose and thought and sort of the moral code, if you will, that Tony creates about tennis, sports, and everything else. So yeah, but I think Rafa to shake free of that based on also the quality of the results they were getting and all that they were achieving, and Rafa's always said it. I would not be a tennis player if it weren't for Tony. I would not be a tennis player.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So I think he feels gratitude for that and maybe a little resentment to play soccer.
I can't think of a greater compliment, genuinely, a greater compliment than the one you give his parents who have this prodigy. So Sebastian and Anna Maria, and I never knew their names until I read your book. And you said they understood when to get out of the way.
I think so. I mean, maybe Sebastian's been very involved with Rafa's business dealings, very involved with business, and he got more involved as time went on. But I think in those critical early years, formative years, he did know enough about sports, his own limitations, to delegate and let Tony do it. Yeah. And Tony, smartly, never was paid directly by Rafa. He was part of the family business. And he tells a wonderful story. I'm not going to tell all the stories here, Joe.
Yes.
They'll read the book. But there is this great one in there about Tony talking about working for the family company, the window company. And he says, if he'd stayed, he has no doubt that he would have done damage to the family's overall business bottom line because it just wasn't his thing, and he was much better off for the family coaching tennis. So it's just some lovely sort of within the Nadal universe perspective there, but from all of them. And I think it just his parents. I'm sure it wasn't easy. I'm sure they doubted sometimes Tony's methods, and I'm sure Rafa went through some hard times because Tony can be a hard guy and disciplinarian. But I think they sensed that Tony's heart was in the right place, and because heck, they were seeing him around that Sunday lunch table, and they saw him all the time. So they all had leverage over each other.
Yeah, insane story when you think about it. From that small island to have conquered the tennis world like that. So look,
and Joe,
yeah,
and Joe, two of them before him.
Yes,
Moya, who later was Rafa's coach. So there's two guys. James Blake, for those who might be American listening, called it like having two number ones in the world from Rhode Island, which is the smallest U.S. state.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. So we'll wrap it up there. We barely scratched the surface. The book is full of these anecdotes and insights. I think tennis lovers will really enjoy it. The answer here may just be not really, because you've covered Nadal in minute detail across his entire career. But in doing the book, did anything strike you about the person or the story which hadn't previously?
I didn't know that he had been such a keyed up, fast-paced player when he was young. That was fascinating to me, to see that the Rafa deliberate, touch the nose, line up the water bottles, take forever to play, then play. I didn't know that wasn't innate. I thought it was. So that was fascinating to me because it opened up a whole layer of understanding about what he had to do to achieve what he achieved and what he thought was necessary to do that.
Yeah,
for sure. And I think also just the connections that he had with Roger were interesting to me too. It was nowhere near as smooth, I think, for the teams, especially all the way through as I had thought from the outside. They did not much surface, but there was a lot of tension at times in that relationship. So that was interesting too.
Yeah, no, great.
But not at the end. Not at the end. I think by the end they really got to a genuinely, perhaps unique place for rivals of that level. But there was more troubled water in there than I would have thought.
No, I have one last page here, which is all about Federer. But you know what? People can go and read the book. We've talked enough. It's really enjoyable. And again, it's called The Warrior. So it is about Rafa Nadal. It's in all bookshops now. I'm sure you can get it online as well, on Kindle, etc. The Warrior, Rafa Nadal and His Kingdom of Clay. Christopher Clarey, congrats. A pleasure. I guess we look forward to the Djokovic one.
Well, Joe, we're taking suggestions. What should it be? The what? What's your suggestion?
Oh, my God. The Outsider? That's a top of the head one. I don't know. It does feel like even it just it has to be a something. But if I could break with your kind of your modus operandi, I just want to be loved.
Subtitle.
Yeah. But I look forward to it.
I don't know if I'll do it, Joe. I'm definitely tempted, but I just this book is very different from the Master on Federer, the one on Nadal, the Warrior, because of the connection with Paris and the clay and sort of, it's not about me by any means, but there's a little bit of me in this one because of the Paris connection you described at the beginning.
Yeah.
I don't want to repeat myself, and I'm sure nobody wants to read me repeating myself. So if I get the right format and the right idea, I'll definitely be tempted. He's still got a little ways to run here. So we'll see. But I think it would be good to kind of complete the circle.
I think it'd be hard not to. Hey, let's see what the royalties bring in. That might sway you. Congrats. Thanks so much. And your time is much appreciated, Christopher Clarey. Thanks, Chris.
Appreciate it, Joe. Always a pleasure.